Hello, welcome to another episode of the Short Story Workshop. I'm Matt Bowles. I'm joined by Melody Bowles and Simone King and special guest, H.P Lovecraft enthusiast, Donald McGregor. In just a moment we will be reading for you Nyarlathotep by H.P Lovecraft, followed by a brief discussion. So, to get us started, Donald, why did you pick this story?
Well, Lovecraft has so many different weird and brilliant stories, and this one I've had my eye on for a while because it's got just a really good mix of being really vague, hard to understand, and a mix of dreams and gods and all sorts of things that just really make you think, oh God, was I meant to understand all of that? Which is all what Lovecraft's about. So,
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So, without further ado, here is Nyarlathotep by H.P Lovecraft. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger, a danger widespread and all-embracing, such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon, as it glimmered on green waters gliding under bridges, and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him, and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings, that what was thrown on a screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophesy, and that in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which shewed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on a screen, I saw hooded forms amidst ruins and yellow evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood up on end, while shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drove us all out down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swear to one another that the city was exactly the same, and still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again, and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary formations and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to shew where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tramcar, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn, for as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows. Trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction only, where they engulf all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished, but my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds, with sores that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the worlds, vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums, and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly, the gigantic, tenebrous ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles, whose soul is Nyarlathotep. Okay, so the exciting part about this episode is that we have two people who are well versed in H.P Lovecraft stories and two people who have never read anything he's written before. So I'm excited to find out what you two thought of this.
So I have read this story, I think, 4 or 5 times to try and understand what it's actually about, which sounds weird because it's pretty much about a malevolent force who destroys cities, I think. The language is very beautiful, but I don't. I found it quite a difficult story to relate to because there's no clear characters or motivation or yeah, I didn't really know what to think of it. Um, I just sort of read it and went, wow, I don't know like how to relate to this. There's no like grounding influence or point to it, so I keep going to that sentence at the beginning, I am the last, and I'm like, this is interesting. So everybody else is dead? Okay. Could we talk more about that?
That's a strange interpretation. I didn't pick up on that.
I didn't, but I don't necessarily disagree with anything you said.
Yeah, it's a hard one to kind of pick apart for sure. And then, like you say, you don't really have the traditional narrative features. Like, there's no real arc. There is like a narrator, but you never really know that much about who it is.
The only character named is a character that I don't even know how to pronounce. Nyarlathotep.
Right.
So would you say then that you were alienated by this story? By how he wrote it? And
Yes, I feel like it wasn't written for me almost.
I think that's kind of meant to be the point, and that's why I really like Lovecraft, is because he tries to alienate his audience.
See, that pisses me off royally. I'm sorry, but
The
that's
thing is,
fundamentally against the idea of why you write stories.
think about it like this. If you were reading a normal horror and they were trying to scare you, they're trying to get your blood pumping, then that's fine. They're trying to invoke something mean, trying to scare you. So he's trying to do the exact same, but he's trying to do it with cosmic horror, which is more of a mind-based fear of just existentialism, where you look at it and you go, oh God. And with that bit where he's showing projections of something that's meant to confuse their minds, or they have no idea what they saw, or they kind of do, but it's so beyond them, they're scared of whatever they saw up in his tower. And you're kind of meant to get that same kind of feeling of, I don't really know what I just read.
I appreciate that, and I think horror is the best medium for exploring the anxieties we have as a society, and fear of the unknown is a massive horror trope that can be explored in that sense, and a massive anxiety we have because there's so much in the world we don't know. But also, I think from a storytelling perspective, if there's nothing relatable, for example, I understand not being able to understand whatever N is doing or his visions, but the fact that there's no grip on the narrator either, or any sense of the world that's given up at the end, I think it loses some of the impact. So ideally you would contrast the complete unknown horror with something slightly more relatable, like a small nugget of something you can put your fingers on, because then that just makes everything you don't understand so much more terrifying, I think.
I actually kind of agree with you there. If it felt more like the real world and then went into the weirdness, it
Yeah,
would
exactly.
feel even more horrifying to get into all that weird stuff, but having nothing to compare it to, it's just like this whole thing is.
I can see why he does it like that. I kind of understood it more once I looked up the context, because I had to look it up because I had Melody's reaction of what did I just read. And it was apparently published in 1920, which kind of made me relook at it again, because then the anxiety about the whole world collapsing makes so much more sense, because they've just had World War One and they're shortly about to go into World War Two, so the idea of something great and unknown evil coming seems weirdly prophetic at that point, and I can kind of imagine it hitting a cultural touchstone that perhaps, I mean, maybe we do have it at the moment with everything happening in the world.
Yeah, when better to have a revival of cosmic horror?
Exactly. Coronavirus hates you, write your gothic stories.
I thought it was interesting the form they were talking about the
Him,
and
the man.
yeah, they were talking about him being a man of science and talking about scientific things, and I wondered if that was about a fear of technological advances.
Yeah, I would say so. He had this kind of weird relationship with science, Lovecraft, where he kind of admired people's kind of curiosity to try and understand the world, I think, but he was also absolutely terrified that we were going to discover something kind of beyond our control or get too powerful as such and just mess everything up.
Well, he was terrified of everything, wasn't he?
He was scared of many things.
And one of the things about science is he always showed an interest in science, but he could never properly understand it. Even base things like light waves, he really tried to understand it, but it was kind of like a child reading this big book about science and kind of getting all these little ideas entirely misunderstood. And that's where most of his writing comes from, is this fear of what he's kind of learnt but doesn't totally understand.
I've read a theory as well that Nyarlathotep was based on Nikola Tesla.
Huh.
There's absolutely no proof of that. It's speculation, but apparently he was going around doing lectures and shows with big electrical displays at the time, so perhaps that's where part of that came from.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So Lovecraft thought Tesla was a deity, a cosmic deity.
Yeah, I mean, apparently, like, he must have been quite shady, right? You have this guy turn up, says he knows all kinds of weird things about electromagnetic fields, and then has these big displays with sparks flying out of stuff. You're going to be a bit scared.
The narrator even says they're more scientifically minded than most, but they're still more terrified.
It's the idea of terror and wonder, isn't it? Mixing that, because they mention both terror and wonder quite a lot, quite rammed down the point that yes, they're terrified, but it's also amazing.
Yeah.
Which kind of fits into the idea of science and technology of, oh wow, look at what we can do, and oh god, what can we do?
It kind of ties into what you were saying about anxiety of it. A curiosity and an excitement of the unknown is so close to an anxiety of the unknown.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a horror trope. That said, when I first read it, I totally thought he was going to be an alchemist or like a sorcerer.
Well, Lovecraft has some stories that were a bit more grounded in normal kind of fantasy, where they have sorcerers or alchemists, and I chose this one because it doesn't really have any of that grounding. It really has Lovecraft just going all out there, going, he's a man of science, and that is as vague as you can get. And by the point when he was writing it, the word scientist was already a thing. But he likes to use these kind of old-fashioned words to make you feel like you're not reading something that's in your time frame. And so he uses all these old-fashioned words even more to alienate you, just because you're like, oh, this is so old, it's weird reading this.
I think it would be more terrifying. I mean, I think, as I said, if it was closer to something that could actually happen to you.
Well, there is a lot of variation in Lovecraft stuff. This is still quite early in his career, I'd say, where he does deal with quite a lot more abstract stuff. I think later on, it's longer, more concrete stories.
That would make sense. The other thing I found about his style, I don't know if I'd be interested if this is across all of his works or just in this particular story, is that he very much tells rather than shows. Like, he tells that people had nightmares when they come to city. He tells that it's terrifying and vague and awful, but he doesn't stop and show any of it, which
Yeah.
I appreciate is maybe an old time technique. But at least in contemporary stories, like, the show not tell is so heavily preached.
I think that kind of links into the fact that he has such a distant perspective, right? And he does this a lot. I think he likes to keep that distance between the reader and the main character, the narrator, because the idea is that if we knew exactly what the narrator was thinking or seeing, then it would affect us as well. It's kind of like this forbidden knowledge.
And it would be less scary to us if we were told exactly what this terrifying dream was. We'd go, oh, that doesn't sound too terrifying. But if he says to you, oh, there was a terrifying dream that I can't even tell you about, if he says to you, there was this unexplainable thing in front of you, and he can't explain it, and so therefore he kind of tries to leave it to your imagination to just be boggled by his weird descriptions.
I think I'd like to know how the narrator felt about it a bit more, maybe.
Yeah, even if we didn't know what it was, but more sense of the emotion might make it more powerful.
That said, the imagery and the language in it is, some of it's very pretty for a horror story.
I really like the green moon.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does some good stuff with color sometimes, and he can describe things in a way that really sticks out and is quite unique.
The abysses between stars, that's amazing. I love it.
When they first started to be, what was it, possessed or I don't know, controlled by Nyarlathotep, and just as it starts talking about the green moon, I just had to start reading that over and over again, because it had some very poetic language, and I think it was really trying to make you feel very confused. Like, there was this one bit where it's saying, the hellish moon glitter of evil snows.
It's prose poetry, though, isn't it?
It's beautiful. But I'm kind of confused why what that even looks like.
Do you think it's there to dazzle and disorientate us?
Hmm. And I think as much as the character is dazzled and disorientated, because like you said, we don't really get to hear exactly how he feels, but because it's narrated by this character, you can kind of tell that when he starts being possessed, he's kind of half understanding that he's possessed, and you get that just through these subtle hints from how he talks. That being said, does anyone actually know what happened in the last few pages? Because I'm a bit confused.
I think
I assumed he got possessed.
Yeah, but then, and so he got possessed and they started walking these different routes. And then there was some kind of gulf, some kind of magic blackness that they all walked into. Not really explained, though, what it was or why.
yeah,
I just assumed they walked to their doom.
I think it's kind of this traditional Lovecraft idea of you have like all the outer gods or whatever, they kind of exist in like this dimension parallel to ours, and then sometimes they like seep through the cracks, right? It's kind of the idea. So I guess this is kind of like they saw through to the other side of this dimension and completely went insane, I guess. That's how I read it.
Though he did mention that other people had gone to see Nyarlathotep's science experiments and were terrified by them and had nightmares and such. But he didn't say that everyone who went to see him like disappeared or anything.
That's true.
Maybe they didn't. Maybe it's just their mind.
Ah, so their mind wandered into this blackness, but actually their body stayed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Which would, I suppose, go with the idea of the world that they see being ruined around them. Like, what if they just never left that room? Like, they pissed him off with their questions. He just never let them fully go back sane. They just lost it. Couldn't take what they were seeing.
That is one bit I specifically like, where he starts saying that he was like saying all this scientific stuff about static electricity, and when Nyarlathotep, kicked them all out, everyone was just kind of going in on what the main character was saying. Yeah, totally, we don't believe it, we're all fine. And I just quite like how it was written, that they all screamed aloud they're not afraid, and you can totally just tell from that they are totally afraid.
That's what an afraid person would say.
It's very 1920s.
They swore to one another that the city was still the exact same. And yeah, right. Quite an interesting way to show that they don't see the world as the same way, just because of them saying that they totally see the world the same way.
I think I'd say the horror is more about what happens to the world rather than the people. Is that what cosmic horror is? I haven't really heard the phrase cosmic horror before.
Cosmic horror is an interesting one because you don't like try to compare it to normal horror at all, because where normal horror is meant to invoke this kind of primal thing inside you where your heart's meant to start beating and you want to run or fight, cosmic horror is meant to be a very brain-based thing. Your blood starts pumping in your brain and you have this existential anxiety, and it's meant to kind of invoke something that's very different than normal horror, where you don't even know if you should run or what, because it's not a primal thing. It's a thing entirely based that humans could do, because we think we understand the world, so when we're told, actually, there's so much more that we don't understand.
Ah, cool. So usual horror is like more about survival and the more primal stuff, and the cosmic horror is more about the idea that there are scary things we don't understand.
Exactly.
I mean, not necessarily. Like, I think our ideas of monsters have been used to do a lot of things in how we view culture and as a framework on how we view our anxieties as a society. For example, there used to be the idea of the monstrous feminine, where anyone who was a woman or who was, like, not a chaste, nice angel of the house was somehow awful or more terrifying because of that. It's a lot to do with, I think, the ideas we have about society, and when those ideas and norms are challenged is normally where horror comes into it. It's why you get so many horror creatures that are, like, queer-coded, for example, or something like that, or they have a disability. It's to do with our ideas of what we would find horrifying, which is often to do with our ideas of what is just not considered normal in mainstream society.
I think a lot of that goes into Lovecraft, to be honest, because, like I said, he was afraid of anything he didn't understand, and he was a very sheltered person back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So he was racist and homophobic, and there's nothing excusing that, but you can understand because he was so sheltered, he was so terrified of anything he didn't understand. So in a lot of his stories, you can kind of tell with that context why he uses different races, both against not human and also as in not white. He uses them as a way of saying, hey, look, they do things differently, and therefore you should be afraid of that.
I mean, yeah, he did describe N as swarthy, aka dark complexion, and it's the one thing I knew about him before going into reading this, was that A, he was known to be a white supremacist, and B, he was supposed to be the master of horror, so...
Two interesting things to know about him.
Yeah, it led to a very biased and very interesting reading perspective.
I think understanding the context, actually, of... sure, I don't condone at all his homophobia or racism, but understanding the context of how he felt and why makes his stories all the more interesting, because you understand what he's trying to invoke and the type of fear that he had, because he didn't understand any other cultures, so therefore he feared them. And so it's meant to have the same thing of not understanding the cosmos because you've never been exposed to that. It's outside your little personal bubble of what you're comfortable with.
I have a somewhat random question. Were Lovecraft's stories popular at the time he wrote
Oh,
them?
absolutely
Did
not.
people enjoy reading
No,
them?
he was not even. He was published in various magazines, but it was quite niche. He would never really. His popularity took off after he died.
Interesting. Okay.
Though many of his friends, after he died, kept writing his style and stories that fit within the Cthulhu mythos. So after he died, it started building up momentum because of all his friends trying to build this all up and people fans of his genre.
Yeah, and it's funny how we had so many of these stories. It's quite self-referential. He references his own stories. Then you have other people writing stories in the same kind of universe. It is like the original ensemble cinematic universe, right? Everyone kind of chips in their own little story.
So are there other stories about N?
Yeah, he comes up a
Yes,
few
He
times.
does appear in later things, and he is confirmed to be this kind of deity. Though it's never
I see.
perfectly explained, but it never should be.
He seems to be different from a lot of the others in that he can take the form of a human, which most of them can't.
Yeah, usually any other deities wouldn't even care about humans or do the types of things that he does, because he sets up all this scientific equipment, and it's just quite an interesting way he goes about it. Whereas I assume Cthulhu would just plunge everyone into dramatic nightmares and kill them all that way.
True chaos. So do you think it's more sinister that N looks like a human, or does it make N like a bit more, almost like you could maybe foil him or if he's more human?
I think it puts him in kind of a respective, like you said, of being a bit more relatable. So at the start, I didn't even realise. I just thought, oh, maybe he's just this weird guy who has some kind of connection to the cosmic horrors or whatever. But as it kept going on, I realised, oh, maybe it's something more. Maybe he isn't just a human. So it kind of, and I do think the writing style kind of matches this at the start. It's a bit easier to read, and you kind of go, okay, I can kind of understand what's going on. And just the more and more that's revealed about Nyarlathotep and how bizarre and how horrifying his discoveries are and what he does, the language gets a bit more poetic and a bit more vague. And so I think it's an interesting way to represent a cosmic horror, because he doesn't start out as a cosmic horror, but the things he shows are.
I personally always find human monsters more scary. Like a cosmic horror, I can kind of be like, well, I'm never going to meet one of those. It's fine. Or like they just look so weird, I wouldn't feel any particular, not to make myself sound like a murderer, but like if I saw a massive cosmic horror and it was attacking me, I'd feel fine hitting it with a baseball bat. If they looked human, I'd be a bit like, oh no, that would be bad of me, at which point I would lose and die. Like, I don't know. Human horrors are far closer to something I think we could actually be ourselves.
Well, I don't think it's ever the point of the actual monster. I mean, in most of his stories, the characters don't actually come across the actual big monsters. It's not they're running away from a terrifying monster, because that would be far too mainstream horror. Instead, it's them skirting around the idea of this monster, and them skirting around this idea of a deity. And so, sure, you're not going to be scared of this giant thing that people have drawn, because in the Lovecraft books, you're not meant to be able to draw Cthulhu. You're not meant to even know what it looks like. It's meant to be unimaginable. The monsters you're running away from in his stories are instead ideas, which are far more scary than just a human, because you can't run away from an idea.
Good point. Excellent point. You can tell I haven't read Lovecraft.
That's why we're here, we're bridging the gap. I do want to talk a little bit more about Lovecraft's life, because every time I read a little bit more about it, I find something else that's interesting. I mean, he just had a horrible upbringing.
Yeah, I think both his parents were sent to an insane asylum and died there. He grew up constantly having, not nightmares. What are the ones even worse than nightmares? Night terrors.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some just awful things happened to him throughout his life that you can kind of understand. I don't know why he's scared of the sea. That's one thing that constantly comes up in his...
Are you kidding? The sea is terrifying.
I get the sea is terrifying, but I want to know exactly why he is terrified of the sea.
Because we only know 5% of what's in the ocean, and he's scared of anything he doesn't know and can't control.
Yeah, he probably read about it in a book and just went, I don't understand any of this, so therefore I will write about it.
Like, you can't bargain with the ocean. It's not like, I will give you fish and you will let me pass without drowning me. Like, this, if the sea decides to drown you, there's not really anything you can do about that. It's not something that can be bargained with, which is what a lot of monsters can be. Like, fairy tale monsters, they're terrible, but you can always bargain with them if they're clever enough. And from what I understand of Lovecraft and what you've said, it's that idea of, like, it's not personal. It's not really got anything to do with you. But if you get in its way, you're screwed.
It's a force of nature rather than anything sentient, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's also, it's the ancientness of the sea. It's something that has been long before us. It's something that we haven't explored and don't understand. And therefore, it's something bigger than the human race. Because it's, who knows what's down there, who knows how much longer the things in the sea have been around than we have, than our ideas have. And so it's very comparable to what he thinks the cosmos is. It's these horrible things from outer space or the sea, that you don't know where they've come from. You don't know how much higher beings they are than us.
Yeah, so we can just add the sea to his long list of things that he's scared of.
What other things?
Just everything. Anything that's different.
Fear of anything more powerful than he is.
He didn't really leave the house very much, from as I understand, but he wrote a lot of letters, which is interesting. Some people think he's like antisocial a lot, but he writes so many letters, which is how we know quite a lot about him, because people dug out these letters and looked through them.
Did he write to lots of different people, or mostly the same people?
I'm not sure. He was quite well connected, though. He seemed to know what was going on in the world, even though he didn't really engage with it. Yeah.
Especially in the writing world at the time. Despite him being not very successful, I think he had quite a couple writing contacts.
Yeah, he was well connected. It's always interesting to read stuff about his life. I always come back to this line I read a while back. Apparently, his mother used to tell him that he mustn't go outside in the daylight because his face would scare the neighbours.
Jesus.
That's quite rude.
Okay, so there's another thing he's terrified of, the mirror.
Very vampiric.
I think that just illustrates how he came into being as a person.
His life really is a cosmic horror. Like, I really wouldn't be surprised that if all his ideas and stories did come from the nether realm, where these deities are just feeding into his dreams. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised.
If it's going to happen to anyone, it's going to happen to him. He's pretty bad luck.
Yeah, but he was also a pretty horrible person, like, given his views of white supremacy and the things he said about, like, he was famously anti-Semitic.
Oh, definitely.
It's kind of chicken and the egg, right? Like, is he a bad person because bad things happen to him, or was it the other way around?
You're a bad person if you support Hitler. Like, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking that this story must be how he feels about the real world all the time, and I'm suddenly feel like I'm really glad that I don't feel like that.
Well, I think it's sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, I do think about how Lovecraft writes, and I think, you know what, that kind of anxiety that comes over you about just normal day-to-day things or the future or an existential anxiety, I think I kind of understand. It's a kind of a curiosity of wanting to understand the unknown, but the more you dig, the more it terrifies you. And so, yeah, he must have had absolutely terrible anxiety and fear of everything, but it's very interesting reading this, and you can kind of say, I can see little bits of that in my life, and how it really opens up a view onto human minds.
Okay, let's, 'cause I know you're particularly interested in this, Donald, let's talk about adapting Lovecraft stories to other mediums, including film, and particularly why that's so difficult, because it seems like no one can quite get it right.
It's because there's nothing to grab onto, surely.
The thing is, when you're adapting something, it's so difficult to know which parts you should directly translate and which parts you have to, like, figure out the meaning behind. Like, if you just read this, how would you possibly film any of it? Someone might say, oh, just film it exactly how you read it, and therefore you end up losing all of this context behind how confusing it is, it's written, and the vagaries of at the end. And you kind of have to start thinking about, okay, what was he thinking about when he wrote this, and how can we re-portray that on film and use the specific things that film can do that books can't, that can portray these very complex ideas and feelings that he wanted to invoke.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to... That's true, it's kind of this innate difference between the mediums, right? You can quite easily explain an idea in a story, but trying to show that is often quite difficult.
I think it would be hard to adapt this in a way that was satisfying to watch.
I think also one of the problems is immediately when people try to adapt Lovecraft and they say, okay, let's look at Nyarlathotep. How do we fill in all these gaps that we're missing when we translate it? They try to do a direct translation. They say, but we miss out all this lovely juicy stuff. And so they say, well, it's cosmic horror, so let's just fill it up with the tropes we already have for horror. So they end up putting blood and gore and jump scares into it, which is entirely the wrong thing. Because when horror was first translated into film, they had to find all these new tropes and things to do. You know, there weren't really many jump scares in books. Well, not the same way that films do it. And so they had to figure out new ways of scaring people on the screen. And so when translating Lovecraft to film or to a video game, you have to think, okay, well, what are the new ways that I can existentially scare someone on screen?
If you had a really good composer, I think that would do a lot for the general undertone of unease, because you can do a lot with music and sudden jolts of music or just undertones of music that you can't do with necessarily visual on its own.
And I certainly think the idea of not showing the monster, the kind of trait that you have in horror, even further than that, partially showing the monster but in such a way to confuse you. All these bits in the book that you think he's kind of not totally explaining what we're meant to be seeing, he's explaining around it. So you know it's vague, you know it's horrifying, so maybe somehow film something where you know it's terrifying. You see these people's reactions, you see parts of the monster, but you have absolutely no idea how to piece it together.
Or you focus on the characters' expressions. So you don't see the thing, you see them and the effect it has on them.
A lot of people have tried to adapt Lovecraft, and usually the main ways they do it is aesthetically. Lovecraft has some brilliantly aesthetical things. You've got tentacles and you've got black slime and things that are just a little bit off. They're not blood and gore, they're just weird and a bit alien. But I'd say the best cosmic horror adaptation that isn't at all Lovecraft, and I don't even think it's meant to be cosmic horror, would be 2001 Space Odyssey. Because it's kind of confusing. It tells a story about how the humans weren't the masters of their own fate. There's something extra-dimensional that controlled the human fate. And nothing's ever perfectly explained in it. And a lot of it does kind of alienate the audience. I don't think Stanley Kubrick was at all trying to do Lovecraft. But it is a way I think cosmic horror could be done, where you just kind of look at it and you go, okay, I kind of understand it, but there's a lot I don't understand, and I think that's kind of the point.
Would you make the argument that not everything should be adapted?
Maybe. You know, if I were adapting a Lovecraft book, I wouldn't want to make the exact same thing, because then you may as well just read the book. But like I said, there's certain things that films can do that books can't, certain things books can do that films can't. So if you're going to adapt something, you need to find what is going to make this special. And I think there's certain things that film may be able to do that could really make Lovecraft and cosmic horror so different, because it's not the same genre as the book. It would be this new genre on screen that makes you feel that existential horror, but in a new way. And I think there's something to be learnt there.
What about using animation? You could do so much with that, because cosmic is about the world. If you are animating, you've got less limitations on what you can do with setting.
That is a good point. And you can draw some things in an animation that could be entirely vague and you're not entirely sure what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I think also one idea I once had was, have you ever been watching something and, I don't know, you switch over to another channel or whatever and it's suddenly in 60 frames per second and it just suddenly looks very off?
I've never had that, but can imagine.
You kind of have that moment where you have to kind of readjust to it, right?
It suddenly looks like it's running a little bit too fast, but it isn't. And so I think if I were ever to do something Lovecraft, as soon as the monster is shown, or as soon as something that is meant to be this vague, this unsettling thing, just suddenly show it in a different frame rate.
That's a good idea.
And it will just suddenly take you back. Maybe not everyone will understand what they're seeing, but they'll notice it. They'll go, oh.
That's a great way to kind of mess with people.
And that's something you can't do in a book.
That's true.
But I think it would take some very creative people. Like, I think Lovecraft was incredibly creative to come up with some of these things. And you have to have someone that's just as creative as him, that understands the philosophies behind his writing, to start anew, to say, I'm going to take his philosophies and I'm going to translate them, but I'm going to have to create it from the ground up.
Are there any adaptations of Lovecraft that do it well?
There's some interesting ones. None that I'd say absolutely get it on the head, but how do you know what's got it on the head? They once did a Call of Cthulhu movie that was a straight adaptation, but one thing I thought was quite clever is to match that kind of old-fashioned style of it, they did it as a silent black and white film. It felt actually a bit campy and didn't totally alienate me, but I thought it was an interesting way of doing it, and they changed all of the narration. Well, they had narration in the film, and they used flashbacks, just the way you would in a film. I'd say the different ways people have done it have been very different ways. Sometimes people have gone for straight horror, and there's these traits that you now find with these Lovecraft films with a lot of flashback and a lot of narration. But these are mostly the traits that you can find in the books, and I think people need to come up with new tropes for the cosmic horror genre.
Would you say that cosmic horror still has relevance? Like, do you reckon it was a product of a very specific time and place, or do you reckon it's still something that would have resonance in horror?
I'd say it's not just specific of its time and place. I'd say it's so specific of just, that genre was created by one man just because of his weird experiences with life. I can't say that if it's still relevant, but as long as there's the fear of the unknown and that existential anxiety and dread, I think it's always going to be interesting to play around with the genre, even if you don't get it exactly as Lovecraft wrote it.
Well, part of the joy of genres is not necessarily trying to recreate what was initially done. Like, it's, as genres develop, it should be about subversion, and once something is set in rules, you can break the rules, you can play with them, you can get inventive. It's like fairy tales. The more we know about fairy tales, the more new things we can do with them, the more we can match them to contemporary times. Like, I think there's almost something about the idea of trying to repeat to what Lovecraft did as being almost a problem, because we're not Lovecraft. We have different experiences. We're in a completely different world to the one he was in. It's almost limiting to try and do Lovecraft as Lovecraft rather than trying to do your own brand of horror. Or maybe people disagree.
No, I think that's actually a really good point. Because you're right, actually, there's an idea that some things aren't a genre. Like film noir, loads of people say it's not a genre because it's too restrictive. And so maybe cosmic horror can only actually become a true genre when people are allowed to start experimenting with it and pushing the boundaries.
I feel like there's still a lot you can do with cosmic horror even in the modern day. There's still always going to be things about the universe that we don't understand. It's become more of a modern trope to play with dark matter and dark energy because, you know, we have these big questions in science that we still don't really have good answers for. And you can always play on that and come up with some grand ideas of what if this is something much larger than us that we can't understand.
Lovecraft wants to lull you into this idea that, hey, the only things that exist are the things that you can see and hear. Because he wants to pull that rug out from underneath you and say, actually, there is a whole world. There's all these beings who they can see and hear and understand far more than you ever could. And you were just tiny, insignificant to them. And I think when thinking about all the new sciences that you've got in the world, dark matter and such, that we are finding more and more to not understand. And more that we can't touch, that we don't know if it totally exists. You know, you look at the Higgs boson. We don't have definitive proof that it is there because we can't interact with it. And essentially we've just ran with theories until we just said, okay, yeah, it exists. There is so much that we have found that we don't understand and can't touch that can really fuel new cosmic horror.
If Lovecraft was alive now, there'd be so much more for him to be afraid of.
Idea from other horror stories I've read and studies I've done is there's been a trend in the last 50 years or so, which is, I suppose, quite interesting when you apply it to Lovecraft and horror in general, is that we've actually, as a society, we've moved away from the outsider being the main cause of horror and fear. Like, obviously, you still have your creepy cults and people we don't understand in horror, but there's also been a lot more emphasis on the idea that the monster is among us and we can't tell anymore. As an example, like, for example, with serial killers and cannibals, because, sorry, it's me, it's a topic I know a lot about, which triggered this thought, but a lot of the stories we used to have about cannibals used to be that the cannibal figure was like the hillbilly, for example, or like the random creepy guy you saw who had nothing to do with your life. Moving on to like Hannibal Lecter, who's very suited, very refined, very much part of like upper middle class society. And like, I wonder how that would apply to Lovecraft.
I mean, I guess you could always have, the evil comes from inside yourself, right? It doesn't have to be an external force. So you could always do that angle if you wanted to go with the same modern trend, I suppose.
Not so much I think the modern trend is better, I'm just interested that it's the trend that society is currently doing.
Where you were saying about understanding something, and we understand the things that we're scared of are the things that we now understand rather instead, but can't do anything about. For example, with Call of Cthulhu, the idea is that this person finds out that Cthulhu is underneath the sea, and he can't stand the idea of knowing it's there, but he can't do anything about it. He can't tell anyone. He just knows that it is there. But there is a sense of him also not totally getting the whole picture, and I think that's part of cosmic horror, that there is a certain curiosity that has to be there. Questions that the character or you as the audience constantly want to be asking. They will just be digging you further and further into this hole of cosmic anxiety, because the more you know, the more you are terrified by what you know. But I suppose if you knew if someone was a serial killer, you still don't. You know a certain thing. You know a certain answer. But it still has so much more curiosity. And I think that's what's kind of terrifying about knowing that your next door neighbour is a serial killer, is because you know something, but there's still more questions, and you could so easily find them out.
Yeah, or the fact that you're curious at all rather than running in the wrong direction does make you wonder if there's something wrong with you, doesn't it? It's like the people who turned up to N's lectures, like, they know. Like, I'm sorry, but if I heard a guy was leaving people having nightmares in every city he passed through, I'd kind of question if I wanted to see him or not.
Well, it's curiosity killed the cat, isn't it? And there's another half of that phrase, curiosity killed the cat and satisfaction brought it back. And I always used to think, oh, satisfaction, if I'm curious enough and I keep on asking enough questions, I'll eventually be satisfied. And I think that's the thing all humans have, is we're all curious and we think eventually we'll be satisfied. But I think the idea of this Lovecraft, and I think in general, if we constantly are curious, we're eventually going to find ourselves in trouble. And we have to tell ourselves we're satisfied and stop digging and just say, you know what? I'm fine with what I know.
Close your eyes, like, listen at the sun. I heard someone say that if we had Lovecraftian horror this day, it would be the sun.
Yeah. I was thinking about the sun actually when we were saying, oh, what about modern horror? I was like, things that we can see all the time but don't really understand. Well, I'm sure lots of scientists understand the sun, but I'm not quite sure. So that could be a good everyday thing to tap into.
You literally look at it and burn your own eyes out. It's horrifying. It's the literal epitome of something you know is there. It's always in the corner of your eye. It has a massive effect in your life, but God help you, don't look at it directly.
There's also something freaky about the moon being able to move the sea. I always thought that.
I think aesthetically the moon has way more Lovecraftian vibes to it. But I'd love to see something done about the sun, because it's omnipresent, and we have gods named after it, and we just think, yeah, it's there. And I think if someone wrote something creepy about the sun, if someone wrote something that made me anxious when I look at the sun, I'd love that. I'd hate it, but I'd love it.
I think the sun is more terrifying than the moon. Like, the moon to me always seems almost weirdly gentle and romantic and dark, but also wonderful. While the sun, it tricks you into thinking it's such a nice thing. Yay, the sun is out. It's giving me cancer, but yay, it's out. Like, the niceness of it is almost more terrifying.
Plus, it's unexplored.
Yeah.
We've landed a man on the moon. The moon is all good. I mean, maybe the dark side of the moon, but we've seen the moon. That's fine. But the sun, oh crikey.
You ain't getting anywhere near that.
Also, they turn into black holes.
It's true.
That is true.
The big ones, anyway. So, I was doing some background research on this story, and I'm just amazed this exists. I found a very interesting adaptation. So, some people in Japan got a hold of some Lovecraft stories and thought, hey, this would make a great light novel series, which then became an anime.
Oh no.
Uh-huh.
Oh my goodness.
And there are many different titles, but I think my favorite one is Nyaruko, Crawling with Love.
That's so Japan. I love it.
That sounds amazing.
Apparently, the story centers around a formless Lovecraftian deity of chaos called Nyarlathotep, who can take on the shape of a seemingly cute silver-haired girl called Nyaruko.
Oh my god, I'm looking at it now.
I just love that this exists. I don't understand how or why.
If the unknown scares you, take it and turn it into anime. Something nice and controllable.
Make it a cute girl. It'll be fine.
Exactly. Girls are both mysterious. We don't understand them as human beings because, everyone knows women aren't actually human. But on the other hand, they're nice and contained.
They are from Venus.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried about that. Well, maybe that's the exact kind of worry I'm meant to have, because it's cosmic horror.
I do have a reviewer for themanime.org called Aiden Foot, who said a character is funny, cute, and likable as Naruko deserves a much better love interest.
Oh
my god.
He wants N
Just
to be
amazing.
his waifu.
Seems so.
This is not what I expected to be talking about when I knew we were talking about this story.
I just couldn't believe it when this came up.
Humans will romance anything.
When I was first searching for Lovecraft films, one of the first that came up, and I'm really annoyed this is one of the first that came up, was a porno called Cool Girl of Cthulhu.
Oh my god.
That is great.
Thought I'd just drop that in there.
Yep, humans are great. I love it.
All right, let's think about wrapping up. Any final thoughts from anyone?
Oh, the big question. Did we like this story?
I did not like it.
I think I liked it.
Bringing endorsement there.
I think that's the great thing about Lovecraft is you're not entirely sure because it is so vague.
I must say that I didn't like it, I'm afraid.
There.
I think that a lot of my enjoyment comes from the fact that I already know a lot about the kinds of stuff Lovecraft writes, and I think if I didn't, then I would not like it at all.
I agree with Matt there. I think my main enjoyment of it comes from the ideas. I really like the ideas. I really like the idea that he writes it in such a weird way. I'm not sure if I didn't know anything about Lovecraft that I'd get that same feeling. I know going in, I'm meant to be anxious. I'm meant to be put on edge with all of his weird writing, but only because I know the context. I like the idea of it. I'm not sure if I actually like the actual stories themselves.
So just the standalone text. It does make a lot more sense now we've talked about it all, but I still feel there's no real reason to care about anything that happens in the story itself. So that's why I don't like it. But this was really interesting, and I'm glad we talked about it.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. You can find all of our stories that we featured in written form on our website and all our past episodes at theshortstoryworkshop.com. See you again next week. And thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable. And I can't. What's the last line of the outro? It goes something like,
Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon.
yeah, that's right.